So let me start off, Congressman, by asking you, given that you were there for so long and saw so much change, what is it about the institution of Congress that you think changed most during your tenure from the time you arrived to the time you're now leaving?
Well, I think as an institution, probably the biggest change that I've seen in Congress is a change in the demeanor or the attitude of people, their interaction with each other. There's much less socialization that goes on today than there was when I first came. Now, I have to step back from that answer a little bit, because when you first come, you're a freshman member, you don't have a lot of assignments, you don't have a lot of responsibilities. As you stay longer, you become a committee chairman, you have more responsibilities, and so your time is taken up more, so you don't have as much time to do the socialization that you would otherwise have. But I think it's very noticeable to me that over the years, members spend less time socializing outside of Congress with each other. And I think that, if you were to ask me why, you'd have to go back further than my tenure in Congress, and it's the advent of jet travel. Before jet travel, members came to Washington, they basically stayed there until there was a summer break or a winter break and went home. Now every member is on a plane the minute the session is over on Thursday or Friday, and they're out the door. And during the week, they spend much of their time over at the RNC or the DCCC on the phone raising money. And so they just don't have time to talk to each other. And if you don't know each other, if you don't talk to each other and you don't know each other, it's a lot easier to say really ugly things about people. When you sit down and you know people one-on-one about their families, you tend to have a different way of looking at people and the way you think about them and talk about them. So I would say that's the number one change that I've seen in the institution.
You know, I've heard from some of the members to whom we've been speaking that there doesn't seem to be the same reverence for the institution of Congress.
I think that's true.
That there was when many of you came in 20 or even 30 years ago. Describe for us a little bit about yourself, how it was that you came to want to run for Congress, to be a member of the House, and how you felt about the institution when you first came into it.
Well, my answer for that is fairly simple. When I was 15 years old, Barry Goldwater appointed me as his page in the United States Senate. So I went to Washington as a 15-year-old sophomore in high school and served for 3 years. In those days, the pages could come anytime in their high school tenure and stay as long as their sponsor would have them. So I graduated from the high school at the end of my senior year. And that experience of serving in the United States Senate as a 15-year-old obviously left me very awestruck. But I went away from that experience with a reverence for the institution. In that case, it was the Senate, but Congress as a whole. And I resolved then that someday I wanted to come back. But I wanted to come back on my own terms when I could be a member, not as a staff person. So I resisted through the years the opportunities that I had to take a staff position on Capitol Hill or even in the administration, the Nixon or Ford administrations in Washington. I resisted that opportunity and said, no, I'm going to wait, and someday I'm going to run for Congress. So I always knew since I was a teenager that was my goal. And yeah, I had a very strong reverence for the institution. And it's still there. I still do think of the institution, but I'm saddened because I think more members really don't have that kind of feeling about it today. It's either just a job, or it's a stepping stone, or it's something they can use to promote their ideological goals. I think there's too much of that.
Well, that brings us to the question of how the public is viewing Congress these days. There is clearly a low regard at the moment. We're in 2006 for the United States Congress. It ranks very low in the public opinion polls. What is it that has brought us to that point, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we need to put this in a bit of a historical perspective. If you look back at some of the campaigns in the 19th century and some of the things that were said about members of Congress in those days, I mean, they were much more scurrilous than the kinds of things that are said today. So people were not hesitant at all about attacking members of Congress. And I don't think the reputation of the standing of Congress has ever been that high. But it does have its ups and downs, and people tend to be, for example, at the time the Republicans came into the majority, in 1995. There was this feeling of that we were going to accomplish a lot of things, and there was a very positive feeling about it. All institutions of government had a real surge of public support after 2001, after September 11th. You could just palpably feel it when you went home. People wanted to put their hand on your arm, on your shoulder. They just wanted to be reassured that things were going to be okay. Why has it gone down now in the recent years? I think a lot of it has to do with the leadership, the Republican leadership in the House. I think there has been a sense of divide and conquer, a sense of we want to accomplish things without using Democrat votes. There's been a sense of division, of trying to spread things apart ideologically. And I think as a result of that, the American people just get very tired of that kind of thing. And they just say, we want people to work together to accomplish things. Republicans have had that opportunity for 6 years since they've both had the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And I think a lot of people just said, you haven't really accomplished what we had hoped you would accomplish. We can go back, and we will, I'm sure, here, talk about different issues like the spending issues and fiscal discipline and immigration and some of the others. And certainly the war in this right now, everybody's unhappy with the president about the war, and I think that spills over into Congress, too.
You talked about divisiveness when you announced that you were leaving in some of the interviews that you gave when you announced that you decided to retire.
Right.
Was the rise in polarization or divisiveness one of the reasons you decided that you were ready to go?
Yes, it was. It wasn't the only, and I wouldn't say it was the primary, but it was certainly one of the issues. I've always said there are 3 good reasons to retire. One, I want to retire when I can walk out of there and not be carried out. I want to retire when I'm at the top of my game, that is when people are not pushing me towards the door. And I want to leave when I decide it's the right time for me to leave. So I think in all of those cases, it was definitely the right time for me to leave. My term limit, I was term limited as chairman of the subcommittee. And these last 6 years have clearly been the highlight of my career in Congress of being chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, which you mentioned at the outset. So that was one of the reasons I would have had to go on to a different subcommittee, and I really didn't see anything else that I would have had the passion and interest in that I had there. So there were plenty of good reasons, but the divisiveness clearly was one of it. I just found myself tired of all that division, and that I didn't find myself enjoying being around most of my colleagues. And I said, that's not a good thing. I should want to be around my colleagues. And I didn't really feel that way.
What is, in your view, the cause? You certainly talked about how the members don't socialize as much as they did. Jet travel has caused them to go and spend most of their time away in their districts on the weekends, or maybe even out raising money on the weekends, getting ready for more combat, the permanent campaign, and so forth. But obviously, there is a type of polarization, a degree of polarization that rose up when Republicans took the majority from the Democrats. Democrats were enraged. They felt entitled to be in the majority because they had been for so long. Republicans didn't trust Democrats to work with them. What do you think, is there one or the other party to blame, or is it both, and what was the cause?
Well, before I get to the specific, let me just say about the general issue of divisiveness. I think Congress is pretty much a reflection of society as a whole. The kinds of people that are in Congress, that represent their districts, the kinds of attitudes and thinking they have. There is less civility today in our society. Go into any school and look at the way teachers are treated as opposed to the way they were treated a generation ago. There's just less respect for authority, whether it's police or teachers or others, and there's certainly less respect for people in Congress, and people in Congress have less respect for each other. So I think members of Congress, in a sense, are a reflection of that change that's taking place in our society. But to bring it down to the specifics of what's happening in Congress today, as I said, I put a good deal of the blame on the Republican leadership. I think Tom DeLay was a very divisive individual. I think he divided people. I think that was a strategy on his part. was to do that. He felt very strongly that that's the way he could keep the majority, was by circling the wagons and saying, we can't count on any of them over there to help us get this done. So we've got to rely on ourselves, and you've got to stand up and be counted here. We only have 228 or 232 votes when we need 218 votes to pass anything in the United States Congress. And he'd say, we've got to get those votes there. Instead of reaching out to the other side and saying, okay, let's look, it may not be perfect, but let's look for some compromises that can bring some of your people over here. And the idea that all good ideas are on one side of the aisle is kind of nonsense. But I have to say, the Democrats have responded to it with a kick in the teeth time and time again themselves. They have spurned any efforts on parts of some of us to reach out and across the aisle. And I think of that particular, we'll come to it, I'm sure, but we'll talk to that in trade, for example, where we've gotten no help at all from the Democrats on those issues.